Hello and welcome back. Well, we finished up last time talking about Louis Pasteur and his triumph over spontaneous generation in 1857 and his demonstration in 1862, which won him the special prize, which I'm not going to try to pronounce again, for doing so. I didn't think I did a very good job of explaining the situation and the experiments that Pasteur did. So I'm going to give it another shot in this video. So again, at the time in the 1850s, spontaneous generation was slowly but surely being drawn and questioned by experts of the day. Spontaneous generation, of course, was the accepted model for the origins of many things. For example, people used to think that rats came from piles of garbage. You know, if you leave a pile of garbage out, there's some rats over there, and they came from the garbage, obviously. Scientists, of course, called this into question, isolated a pile of garbage, no rats. So similar things with, fleas and mosquitoes and things like that hatching out of grains of sand. They just came from the ground. And so before the mid 1800s, we've already seen spontaneous generation disproved and discredited in many areas of science. However, there were many people who just believed that microorganisms would spontaneously generate in specific situations, right? And Pasteur is running around and sort of kind of stumbles across this phenomenon in his own work, where he is trying to preserve the crops of French farmers, specifically trying to preserve wine. Okay, wine, of course, before the days of electricity and refrigeration everywhere, was just about the only way that you could preserve a crop. Okay, wines and beers, of course, were historically used for that. Great source of calories in the wintertime when you're unable to get fresh produce, right? Possibly even unable to travel. Well, anyway, so Pasteur is noticing that all of the casks of wine that he is examining that are soured and have gone bad have microorganisms in them, and that none of the ones that are in good shape have these same microorganisms. So he reasons that there's a causal relationship here. And he says, look, if maybe you can keep these organisms from getting into your wine, you could preserve it and you wouldn't have so much of your harvest. Perhaps in some cases up to half or maybe even more of their harvest was contaminated and went to waste. So he's running around saying these kinds of things in the mid 1850s and actually showed spontaneous generation to be impossible around 1857. Well, this angered a lot of folks and they started questioning his experiments, right? Of course, many of the farmers really appreciated his work and put some of his theories into practice. And, they were big fans of his because he was helping them to preserve their crop. They saw the results right there, the proof in the pudding, as they say. They were making more money because of implementing Pasteur's practices. And so they supported him, of course. And they were very grateful to him, I'm sure. So Pasteur is a big enough deal that he's able to stand up to this criticism. This has not been possible before in germ theory. If you look at the life of one Ignaz Semmelweis in the Hospital of Vienna, he had been a proponent of germ theory and basically had been committed to an insane asylum as a part of that whole process. So what a mess that was. Pasteur is a big enough deal. He has enough clout, enough pull that he's able to withstand the criticism leveled against him and respond to it. Okay. So, of course, Pasteur is developing this process called we now call pasteurization, where you bring things up to a boil and cool them off quickly, or bring them up to a certain temperature and cool them off quickly, which shocks the bacteria that are in there. For example, in milk, commonly pasteurized, this helps to drastically reduce, or in some cases, if you get it warm enough, eliminate the bacteria that would normally be present in large amounts in again, in milk, for example. Critics of Pasteur criticized that, he was destroying something, for example, in chicken broth. If you bring it to a boil, well, maybe you're destroying something in the chicken broth that is able to cause spontaneous generation. So, of course, Pasteur brings it to a boil and then shows that it will grow bacteria in it if it's left open to the air, right? Whereas other vials of broth, if you put a cork on them after boiling them, they don't grow these microorganisms. So then the next criticism, of course, was that he was cutting off the air, right? So his critics stipulated and said, look, air is necessary for spontaneous generation. So cutting off the air, you prevent spontaneous generation. And when you remove the cork, now spontaneous generation is possible. So Pasteur developed two different experiments in response to this. And this is what eventually won him the argument in 1862 that spontaneous generation was impossible. Okay, they offered 2,500 francs, small fortune, to anyone who could prove one way or the other. So this led Pasteur to develop swan-necked flasks. So he's allowing air into the beaker, but not bacteria and the dust that would be collected into the tip there, right? So he had some flasks that he designed in this way, other flasks where he had a special filter that he used to allow air through, but not the bacteria and the dust particles and those kinds of things. And so he got them up to a rolling boil. Again, some of his critics did not boil their flasks or whatever they were using for their media. They didn't boil it long enough or hard enough. He would boil it for, I think his number was 4 minutes. Yeah, they never generated any kind of organisms, didn't have any kind of organisms growing in there. Whereas he could break the flask, the tip of the flask off. Anytime he did that, 24 hours later, a healthy population of bacteria is present there, which was really easy to see in broth because it's cloudy, right? You don't even need a microscope to see that. And the smell changes and all that, right? Whereas the ones that he didn't break the neck off of were still perfectly clear. There was no bacterial growth in them, right? And of course, you don't even have to break the neck of it off. You can just swish this up and allow it to come into contact with the air, with dust particles and things like that. And 24 hours later, it will grow bacteria. Pasteur's experiments were so ironclad at this point. He had destroyed every argument that had been brought up against him, that he wins the prize money in 1862. And some people use this as the start of the modern science of microbiology. It's as good a date as any, probably. The other one you might pick would be, of course, the invention of the microscope. Now, I do want to point out that Pasteur is a human, right? Any human makes mistakes, and Pasteur, being who he was, did make some mistakes. We now, I believe it has been proven. There was a lot of debate about it years ago, but I'm pretty sure it has been proven at this point that Pasteur did plagiarize some of his material. So he wasn't perfect, right? And neither is anybody. So that in no way invalidates his contributions to the science. It's just to say that at times he made mistakes, and again, plagiarism at that time really wasn't considered the problem that we consider it today, and we might be a little bit too obsessed with those kinds of things. And it, of course, bothers me a little bit whenever people really want to discredit somebody. They just try to find one thing that they've done wrong. That's a extremely immature thing to do, because, of course, all of the humans have done something wrong. So does that really invalidate the good things that they have done, the contributions they've made to society? And, certainly Pasteur's contributions are something that has helped many, many millions of humans all over the billions, perhaps, of humans all over the world whose lives have been improved by taking these discoveries to heart. And, so I think that's very important that we have that proper perspective when we're studying these kinds of things. And also that we admit when someone who's a hero of ours, like George Washington, no hero of mine, but a hero to many, we realized that, this guy really wasn't the the saint that media has made him to be. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But of course, Louis Pasteur, we looked at this quote last time. Yeah, I don't think I could have said it any better myself. And nothing has changed anything about that statement in the last 150 years or so of modern genetic research and microbiological research. We mentioned last time that this is about as much as they knew, right? So spontaneous generation was still considered possible, if not in present Earth's atmosphere, perhaps in the distant past, it was possible. And they can be forgiven perhaps for clinging to that religious belief. Okay, if you believe something despite the evidence, I don't know, that's not a proper religion. That's more of a delusion. Okay, but anyway, we can forgive them for thinking that because, well, you could possibly argue, look, we don't really know that much about a cell. So we have come a long way in our understanding of a cell. In this case, the red dots here, which show up as just a couple of pixels on the screen, hopefully you can see those, represent proteins which are synthesized and excreted from the cell. And also they represent ribosomes. Ribosomes are the proteins, one of the main proteins responsible for making more proteins. There's 30 or 40 other proteins that are directly involved as well, but usually reserved for somebody with a detailed knowledge of biochemistry and cellular reproduction to study those things. I don't think I ever studied anything beyond like ribosome and helicase and some of the maybe 3 or 4 others that I used to remember. Okay. We know so much about a living cell that it is impossible to represent that knowledge in one picture. Okay. So we're going to examine Pasteur's claim that living things only come from living things, which I personally believe to be one of 2 laws in biology, the other being that all things reproduce according to their kinds. Okay. So we're going to examine Louis Pasteur's claim. Is it reasonable to say that living things only come from living things? All right. So one of the things we need to understand is how complicated they are. If you're going to get a living thing from something that is non-living, we need to be able to compare. We'll basically try to explain, if you're an evolutionist, try to explain how a non-living chemical gave rise, for example, to a protein, okay, which is a very complicated organic molecule that is absolutely necessary to build a living cell. You need tens of thousands of proteins to make a cell, and you have to assemble them all in the correct order, and you have to assemble the correct numbers of them. But that will save that argument for later. For right now, let's just focus on how hard would it be to build one protein by random chance. Okay. So we're going to need to know what proteins are. Well, proteins are your physical reality anyway, is made of proteins. There are other parts to you. There's a big part of you that is fat. This is why fat is such an important part of your diet. It's not so much eating fat that makes you fat either, although it can. It is eating sugar that makes you fat, by the way. I think we probably talked about that before, but a major reason why Americans have so many problems with being overweight is the amount of sugar that they consume. So there's a big part of you that is made of fat molecules and membranes of all of your cells. Many of the parts of the insulation of your brain and stuff like that are made of fat molecules. Okay, and a big part of you is DNA, and a big part of you is protein. So much of your physical reality is made up of those things. Okay, so all of the machinery of the cell, all of those kinds of things are are made of proteins. Okay, so what are proteins made of? Well, we call them a macromolecule for kind of 2 reasons. First, some proteins are visible at the very highest magnifications of optical microscopes. Ribosomes are these tiny infinitesimal specks at those magnifications. So they can kind of be seen, thousands and thousands of atoms put together can block enough light that the human eye can detect it at maybe 2,000 times magnification. The second reason we call them macromolecules, probably the most important, is that they're actually made of smaller molecules we call amino acids. Now, making amino acids by random chance is probably impossible. We've had some scientists try to demonstrate that amino acids can arise in nature by completely, without a living thing to give rise to them. Most of those experiments that are done, they involve some kind of zap of electricity and some kind of a heating and some kind of cooling. And, you can really pick them apart because those kinds of mechanisms really don't exist in nature. The tiny amounts of energy, probably not possible. We have bolts of lightning, but we don't have tiny little sparks usually that happen in nature. So in other words, the same kinds of energy that would possibly create some of these molecules would end up destroying them, most likely. The other reason you might really criticize these kinds of experiments to try and show that amino acids can arise from non-living chemicals is to point out the amino acids that they make have the proper chemical formula, but they do not have the proper structure. If I remember correctly, you need left-handed, or in other words, oriented a certain way, amino acids in order to build proteins. The ones we've been able to create synthetically, if you want to call it that way, are all right-handed, and so they don't form the long chains with those peptide bonds between the amino acids that you need in order to build a protein. A third criticism might be that anytime they find amino acids out in space or on comets or something, they assume they came from living things. So maybe they actually know that amino acids only come from living things. Just wanted to point that out. Okay, so lysine. Lysine is a fairly straightforward molecule. We see here the ball and stick sort of structure of the molecule. And this is more of what you would get if you're drawing it by hand, especially if you're a Cartwright that can't draw very well. In here, in organic chemistry, all these little joints here represent carbon atoms, which are bonded to two hydrogens. So we don't even draw in the hydrogens or the carbons, many of the hydrogens, in organic chemistry. So we see what it represents here. This is, again, more of the ball and stick. You can also get, nowadays, they're very common, electron cloud type diagrams, which are basically that, just like inflated, or every sphere there would be inflated to show maximum extent of its electron cloud. And that gives you more of an idea of how the molecules fit together in a protein, right? So a fairly straightforward molecule. We see all 20 amino acids. Some of them are electrically charged, others are polar and non-polar. They all, have similar, you might say, backbones to them, where various other things are added to them. We see probably some familiar ones like tryptophan. Tryptophan gets blamed for causing sleepiness, especially around Thanksgiving. It's not necessarily the tryptophan. It's, eating that much around family and those kinds of things can cause you to be quite tired. But I did want to point out that they're quite different from one another. You can't just go swapping these guys around in a protein and expect the protein to have the same shape that it needs in order to function properly. Okay. So these are the bricks. They have to be arranged in a specific order if we're going to make a specific protein. For example, ribonuclease. Ribonuclease is the smallest protein known to science. All right. It only has 17 out of the 124 amino acids. Excuse me. It only has 17 out of the 20 possible amino acids. And there are 124 of them in that chain. Okay. So every other protein involves more than 124 amino acids. Some of them involve hundreds and hundreds of amino acids. Okay. And then you have to assemble them all in the correct order. And then you have to fold it into the correct shape to get the proper protein. We're going to ignore the protein folding problem because that we don't even know the numbers on, but we do know the numbers on how difficult it is to assemble a certain sequence of these guys. Okay. So this is more of the electron cloud type structure that I was talking about earlier. You can see represented here sort of the maximum extent of the electrons or the distance they are from the nucleus. Now, it's not a perfect illustration, but it's pretty good. This type of imagery is highly accurate compared to, for example, an electron density scan, but they're very difficult to do. So X-ray crystallography is how you get these images, and yeah, it's very difficult to actually crystallize proteins. That is a whole discipline in science all by itself. So if you can figure out how to crystallize these guys, you can figure out their structures, which is a key part of understanding how, for example, how drugs interact with proteins. Or maybe we take a step back and say, well, how do they interact with each other? But, and why do certain changes in their structure cause certain diseases and those kinds of things? So this is the smallest protein known to science, and yeah, it is pretty involved. Okay, so one of our claims, we're agreeing with Louis Pasteur, is that meaningful structure requires information. You cannot get this kind of a structure by random chance. You can take all these pieces and throw them into your clothes dryer and set it on high for 200 years. It is never going to build this structure. Okay. You're just going to end up with chaos. Now, we've always said this as creationists, as folks that believe in an intelligent designer, but now we can prove it. Now, remember, in science, you can't really prove anything, right? Because it's impossible to get all the data, right? Or even to know how much of the data you have, what percentage of the data you actually possess. So you have to kind of hold science with an open hand because you can't prove anything. However, in math, you can prove these things. And yeah, so you have to understand where, you have to have information in order to build these structures. Well, we're going to take a little bit of a break from that discussion and talk about Mendelian genetics. Okay, where does this information come from? Well, it comes from your genetic code, of course. Darwin had no idea that this code existed. He had no idea what DNA was, and he had no idea how physical characteristics got passed on from parents to offspring. It was not known at his time. There were a lot of speculations on it, and you can go dig around in history. It's pretty hilarious. A lot of the scientists at the time absolutely had some ridiculous hypotheses about how physical characteristics got passed on from parents to offspring. It is true that the pattern of that inheritance is not all that consistent. For example, eye color. Eye color is actually determined by like 3 different genes. And so it's a little bit complicated. Certain recessive traits can skip a generation, can skip 2 or 3 generations. So it's a little difficult to figure this kind of stuff out, even if you're working with an organism like a sheep or a horse, that over your lifetime, you might get to work with 20 or 30 or maybe even 40 generations. The pattern was not always recognizable, and compiling all that data and having it all in front of you so you can analyze it, a little bit difficult. And of course, if we're working with sheep, do you know for sure that this particular ram got with that particular ewe and it wasn't some other ram? So there was a lot of discussion and debate about these kinds of things. It wasn't known and it wasn't proven until the genius of one Gregor Mendel. Okay, so Mendel is born about the same time as Darwin, a little bit later than Darwin, 1822. Okay, to a farming family. Translation, he was poor. Most families at the time were. something like 80% of the population at this time lived on less than $1 per day in today's money. So these guys are scraping by. They can barely afford to eat, right? His father taught him selective breeding and plant grafting. So farmers were smart enough to figure out that, okay, if you want certain characteristics in offspring, those have to be present in the parents. So they would select the best stock that they could to give rise to the next generation, right? Now, at this time in history, basically what we call elementary school, that is up to 8th grade, was the only school that was paid for by the state. Why? It's the only school you need. You learn to read, you learn to write, you learn to do basic math. Those are the only skills that you need. You're a farmer. You need to be able to count your cattle. You need to be able to balance your budget and read the Bible, read various publications from hopefully some folks that are going to try to teach everybody how to do farming better or make your experiments known, those kinds of things. You don't really need to do algebra, do you? You probably don't need to know Latin to be a farmer. You probably don't need to know Shakespeare or really much about geography. There's a lot of stuff you actually don't need to know in order to be a very excellent human being and live out your life doing the work that's in front of you. So Mendel is, in middle school, what we would call middle school, and his scientific genius really impresses his teacher. And they are like, look, you got to send this kid to high school. Now, high school, in my opinion, should not be universal and it should not be mandatory. Okay, so here we're getting a little bit off into the weeds again, but this is a very important concept to understand. One of the biggest mistakes we ever made as a society was requiring everybody to go to high school. Why did we do that? Well, you guessed it. It's because of the political left. They figured out that all these people who had high school degrees made a lot more money than people who did not have high school degrees. And as the economy grew and improved, they reasoned that you needed to make high school education free for everyone. And when they did that, high school enrollment did not increase very much. What? Okay, it increased, but there was a lot of people who didn't go to high school. So they had to make it mandatory. Now, I have to agree with the libertarians on a lot of stuff. And one of the things that is very difficult to argue with them about is that good ideas are never mandatory. If it's a good idea, people will just do it. Okay. Well, mandatory high school education came to America. And since we were the most prosperous nation in the world, the other nations of the world figured that they should do it too. Here's the problem. Not everybody can do algebra. Not everybody can learn Latin. Not everybody has the motivation. People don't, advanced chemistry and physics and those kinds of things. Your typical farmer's kid knows that they really don't need to know that in order to be a good farmer. And they don't have a lot of motivation to sit on their duffer for 8 hours a day to learn it. So what is a school teacher to do? Well, they of course develop classes that are more appropriate for someone who's really not interested in being a lab technician or a lawyer or a doctor and may or may not have the mental aptitude for those tasks, right? And so we see shop class and we see home education and we see quilting and we see sewing and we see canning classes and we see animal husbandry classes. And we see experiments they would do with their crops and all those kinds of things. And it was great. Not to necessarily justify the extreme expense in, these kids, 12, 13, 14 years old used to be out working in the fields. And now they're spending 4 years of their life not working in their fields. And you also have the school teachers, of course, who are out there being a burden on the taxpayer. And can they really justify it? Well, I think they did a fairly reasonable job. And then the leftists got all upset again, because what did they do? Now a high school diploma is less valuable. So we have seen in the modern government school the elimination of home education and shop classes and furniture building and woodworking classes and welding classes. And we've seen the elimination of most of those programs in favor of trying to get more kids into Algebra 2 and pre-calculus and a whole bunch of other classes that they don't want to take. Okay. Why? Because we're only producing something like a third of the scientists we actually need. Why do we need so many scientists and engineers? Well, if you're going to build weapons to dominate the world, you're going to have a lot of scientists and engineers. I don't think I want to dominate the world. I don't think America should be in that position. We're 4% of the world's population. Where do we get off thinking that we should be the police force for this entire globe? Just because we're wealthy enough that we own half of the planet, 50% of all the wealth in the world is owned by Americans. Right, but should it? I mean, is that our birthright? That certainly wasn't the case before World War II. It just so happens that after World War II, we were the only superpower left standing, really, that hadn't been, think about it, the bombing that Great Britain had gone through, the extreme taxes on their economy by going to a wartime economy. Look what happened to Russia. Russia had lost 90% of their military age fighting men in World War II. Look at France. Good heavens, they were occupied by the Nazis for almost 5 years, 4.5 years. I don't even have to tell you what happened to Japan and Germany and China. We were the only ones left standing, and we just thought it was our spoils of war to be manufactured for the planet. Everybody was driving Dodges and Chevrolets and Fords. Everybody bought GE appliances. They're all made in America. They didn't have a choice. They didn't have any factories left, right? And so American factories are putting out 110%, and every time the union comes and asks for a raise, they get it because they can afford it. So eventually you got people making, and I'm talking about in the 70s, making $40 an hour to push a button at a factory. And they just thought they were entitled to it. Well, it all started to come to an end in the 70s, of course, because people were manufacturers and factories in other countries were starting to recover. The economies were starting to recover in places like Germany, Japan especially, and China. Maybe not so much China at that time. China had to partially capitalize its communist economy. That didn't happen until really the 90s. But you understand what I'm saying? In the 80s, World War II veterans in America started looking around and asking who had won World War II anyway, because we got all these BMWs and Toyotas and Hondas driving around. People are driving these vehicles, right? Because American factories really gotten too big for their britches, and they were charging ridiculous amounts of money for pieces of junk. And it was German manufacturing was superior. So America has kind of had to play catch up. In a lot of ways, we just haven't. We just decided to buy it all from China. So, anyway, all that to say, should we really be the only mega power on Earth? Do we really deserve that? Is that our future? Because I don't think that it is. Maybe we don't need all these engineers and scientists and stuff. Maybe we should focus on a more realistic economy, and maybe, just maybe, that includes plumbers and welders and people that work with their hands, electricians, HVAC guys, auto mechanics, road workers. These people don't need algebra 2. They don't need calculus. They don't need chemistry. They don't need physics. They need a good work ethic, and they probably ought to be out there working by the time they're 14 or 15. Maybe not 40 hours a week, but good heavens, put them in a trade school. You have any idea how difficult it is to find enough labor? We're importing labor from Mexico, for crying out loud. We used to do all that work. We need to do all that work. Good heavens, we have at this moment, as of the making of this video, something like 10 million job openings in America and 8 million people on welfare. So maybe high school should not be mandatory. However, in this case, it really bit this guy in the butt because his elementary teachers didn't do him much of a favor in getting him into high school. There should be some kind of an allowance for people who don't have a lot of money, but do have the aptitude and the ability and the mental capacity, the work ethic to excel in the scientific world. That's what scholarships are supposed to be for. Well, for some reason that just didn't happen for young Mendel. And so they had to pay to send him to high school. Okay. His parents can't afford it. And a lot of times he has to choose between buying his books and buying food, and he chooses his books. He almost starves to death in order to finish his education. Wow. His younger sister, I should learn her name, eventually gives up her dowry so he can finish high school. After graduating, he attempts to become a teacher and fails. By the way, his sister's story is a really cool one because she gives up her dowry, and which is basically her marriageability. This is the money she is saving up so that she can present it to her husband and they get married so they can have something to start with. And she doesn't have it anymore because she's given it to Mendel to finish his education. However, some young man comes along and marries her anyway, even though she doesn't have a dowry. So kudos to him. And they end up doing really well. Mendel, after he's successful, sponsors all their kids and provides them with a great education and supports them. So I think that's just a cool story. Anyway, so kudos to her. She received the blessing for that sacrifice. So after Mendel graduates, he attempts to become a teacher and fails. I know, he has a high school diploma. That's it. That's all he has. And he wants to be a teacher? Well, in those days, a high school diploma was worth a lot of money. He then joins a monastery and again tries to become a teacher. This guy has nothing but a high school diploma and a smile. So it wasn't unusual, but he does fail to become a teacher. But one of the examiners is impressed. And here's where that scholarship comes in. He gets him enrolled in the University of Vienna. He actually studies under Doppler, okay? And that's his favorite subject is actually physics, which is odd, but yeah. When he graduates the University of Vienna, which is probably like the greatest university in the world at the time, he tries for a third time to be a teacher and he fails for having too much original thought. And that is a warning to people like me, because I have a lot of original thought. And I have no problem questioning the wisdom of my elders. And I have no problem asking them to prove that what they think they know is actually true. And I have to be careful. Because even in the 1800s, the establishment is the establishment. The old people are conservative. They just want to keep things the way that they are. And even if I give them very good reasons for changing, they don't like it. That's a problem, by the way. That's a maturity issue. If you're listening to this and you have some young people in your life that are trying to make some beneficial changes and your only response is to shut them down, because after all, you don't like change, shame on you. I'm running into this. I've always run into this kind of thing. trying to be a mover and shaker as much as I can be anyway, in the world. For example, trying to build a rain catchment system at one of my schools, and the powers that be at the church have shut me down at every turn. They, in their position and in their voice, they support my efforts to solve their problem, which is extreme amounts of erosion, but they are not supporting me in my methods. I haven't even asked them to support me financially. I'm going to fund the whole thing, and they still don't want to do it. So you got to be careful trying to bring your solutions into the world. There's a lot of the world that doesn't want your solutions. They would much rather things just stay the way they are because they're comfortable that way. And that is the frustration of young people everywhere in every generation. Okay, you see problems in the church and you want to try to solve some of these problems, you're going to run into resistance of the establishment, just like Mendel did. Okay, so be careful. Sometimes you got to lead from behind. Sometimes you got to be patient. Okay. This also is a kind of a warning against putting all of the power in the hands of, well, the oldest people that there are. They shouldn't just get to make decisions just because they're older. Who's responsible? That's the question. Are they going to take responsibility for this? Are these people on trying to design a rain catchment system, are they going to fix the erosion when it happens? No? Okay, well, if I'm responsible for it, then maybe I should be the one who makes the decision. Well, Mendel fails to become a teacher, and so he turns his work to peas. I almost think this is kind of his revenge on those monks for failing him, not allowing him to become a teacher. So he works with these pea plants for 8 years. I bet they got really tired of pea soup. So the first thing that he does is he establishes populations of plants that breed true. In other words, there are tall plants that always give rise to tall, or there are short plants that always give rise to shorts. There are axial flowers that always give rise to axial flowers. Purple flowers always give rise to purple flowers, etc. Okay. So those are his purebred populations, at least with respect to that, whatever characteristic he's measuring there. After that, he crosses all the true breeding population and notices that in every single case, 100% of the offspring have only one characteristic. So he crosses the tall with the short, all of the offspring are tall. He crosses the purple with the white, all of the offspring, I think their purple flowers are dominant, or he figures it out that they're dominant. He crosses axial with, I forget what the other type of flower is. Oh, terminal. Axial versus terminal flowers, and all of the offspring have, I think it's axial flowers that are dominant. I forget which one is the dominant trait, but you understand what I'm saying. Only one of the characteristics from the parent plants gets passed on to the offspring. In other words, the other characteristic seemed to disappear. So then he takes that hybrid, the offspring of the true breeding populations, and allows those, hundreds of plants to self-pollinate. And he notices that that other characteristic shows up again. 25% of the third generation, you have the parents, you have the hybrids, and then now you have this hybrid cross that's self-pollinated. They have that missing characteristic from their parents. Okay, it skipped a generation. Mendel actually figured out that each parent gives not one but two genetic characteristics, or could give one of their genetic characteristics to their offspring. If both of them are tall, then it can only give the tall one. Okay, so if you have a purebred tall plant, it's always going to give a capital T for tall to its offspring, and that capital T, if it is present, will express itself. If it has a tall and a short, then there's a 50-50 chance that it will give the short gene to its offspring. Okay, so if mom and dad are both hybrids, then there's a 25% chance that their offspring will the offspring will get two copies of the short one from mom and one from dad. So 25% of their offspring will express that genetic characteristic. By the way, that's why inbreeding is a problem. Inbreeding is not a problem because of a lack of genetic diversity. It is a problem because of those organisms can have the same mutations. And so some of their offspring will suffer from getting a mutant gene from mom and dad. Before mutations were widespread in the population, it was not a problem to marry your sister, right? Like Abraham married his half sister. That was not a problem back in those days. Mutations were not the issue that they are today. Several hundred years later, in the law of Moses, he says, look, you cannot marry anybody closer than your cousin because of hundreds of years of mutations have built up in the population. And it's now getting to the point that inbreeding is becoming a problem. People are suffering because of this. Okay. So Mendel figures this out. He cracks the code on genetic information. So we'll study more about Mendelian genetics next week. See you then.